I want to welcome you all to the first Morrill lecture of 2020. Thank you so much for being here. As you know, we do these lectures in honor and memory of Joshua Morrill. And like him, these are all about community, right? Bringing people together in the River Valley in this amazing, beautiful place to learn and grow together. And that's what we're here to do tonight. So when I read about Dr. Ajay Sethi's work, I thought, wow, that's really interesting stuff. And I could see this being a great topic for a lecture. But I was concerned. Right now, talking about information or misinformation can feel partisan. It can feel divisive. And this series is all about community. So when I had my first conversation with Ajay, I brought it up. And his response was not just comforting, it was inspiring. He told me that he believes in building bridges, that he wants to help people get out of their bubbles, out of their echo chambers, and to listen to what other people have to say. And I knew as soon as we hung up the phone that he was the person to come and speak to us tonight and to help us navigate this complicated topic. So with that, I give you Dr. Ajay Sethi.
Thank you so much. And Steph, I really appreciate that you invited me to give a lecture in this series in Josh's honor. I read a little bit about him, and I learned something about Josh through you, and we've talked. And I've also got a good friend, Amy Fruchtman, who used to work with Josh. And the other day, I met with her just for her to share with me a little bit about him. A lot of the things that I'd read were consistent with what she said. And the one thing she added was that he had a great laugh. And I really appreciated that. I can say, being at the university, I get lots of opportunity to speak in front of people. But it's always sort of in the comforts of campus and in a classroom. And to be out in a community is just really special. It's also really special to be invited to leave a comfort zone that is a classroom or a campus, to come out and talk to people, to have sort of real conversations. And I really appreciate that. It's truly a tremendous honor. So thank you, everybody, for attending tonight, to be willing to listen to me in such a beautiful setting, in such looking at a very beautiful venue from this angle, and I appreciate that. A little bit about me. So I am originally a Marylander. For a brief moment, I was an Ohioan, actually for 5 years, so that's not so brief, but especially nowadays, the way we think about time. And now I've been a Wisconsinite for 12 years. I have a dog. His name is Bentley. He just turned 12 on July 1. He happened to be born the day that I signed my contract to take on the position I have right now at the university. But I didn't know him when he was born. He was rehomed to me 5 years ago. I had known him for 1 or 2 years. We became friends. And then his owner had passed away, and so he was rehomed to me, became my roommate, and we learned to live with each other. And I can just say that one of us is wrapped around the other one's paw. So I've been teaching a course at the university called Conspiracies in Public Health. It's a course that I've been teaching for 4 years, and frankly, I was teaching it under the radar. I didn't publicly really talk about this class, mainly because of the title, frankly, and I didn't want to attract attention. And I was trying to get my bearings, trying to figure out how I wanted to teach this class. Naturally, the title does draw attention. And when I first proposed the class, a lot of colleagues had come to me and said, the title's a little negative. It was part of the course review process. This was the feedback I was getting. And it also seems to imply that there are indeed conspiracies in the field of public health. And so to that, I just simply responded. I said, well, actually, there are, at least from the perspective of people who believe in them. And it's really in that spirit that I wanted to create this class, is to teach this from the perspective of people who may believe in such conspiracies. And frankly, we cover actual conspiracies that have occurred. Okay. It's sort of with the same perspective that I want to talk to you tonight about sort of how we approach conversations with other people to keep their perspective and sort of their thoughts in our own minds. Listening to and understanding the perspectives of others is how really we should approach such conversations when we try to address misinformation. It is how we would want others to approach us with an open mind and a willingness to listen. Okay. Now, I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist, and by no means am I a psychologist. I sometimes refer to myself as an armchair psychologist, but only around non-psychologists. Is there a psychologist in the... So frankly, the subject of this class was a little bit out of my comfort zone. And as I said, I'd been sort of teaching this class under the radar. When COVID hit, naturally a lot of topics, or a lot of issues around conspiracies and misinformation came to light. And a reporter had caught wind that I was teaching this class and did an interview with me. And it was that Q&A that Steph ended up reading that one thing led to another, and here I am today. So yes, I decided to teach this class even though it wasn't something that I was used to teaching, but lifelong learning is really important, and I was totally willing to immerse myself into a literature and package that for students because I sensed a sense of urgency that outweighed any initial concerns that I had. It was a time following our country experiencing very large measles outbreaks, if you remember them. 2014, 2015, we had seen outbreaks of measles that we hadn't seen for many years. I was also becoming increasingly concerned how previously innocuous topics related to health were suddenly becoming very hot-button issues. We started to just debate a lot of things that previously were not something debated. I had also read some case reports and studies that said that some physicians, some pediatricians, family medicine physicians, were more likely to sort of avoid talking to parents if they suspected that they were going to refuse vaccination. And maybe they would even not have such parents in their practice. And I realized that this was quite a complex issue, and it was not the direction I thought we should be going in. Being at the School of Medicine and Public Health at UW-Madison, we educate, we train students in all sorts of clinical professions. I'm also faculty director of our public health program, which is also a professional degree there. And all of our students someday are going to be joining a workforce where they're going to need to have the skills to talk to people about topics that may be seen as hot-button issues. And I didn't want a future where our healthcare professionals and our public health professionals, were afraid to do that. I didn't say it was necessarily easy to figure this out either. So all of these things led me to create this class, Conspiracies in Public Health, with the aim to build these skills in our students, to have these difficult conversations with patients, with clients, and communities. So of course, we examine popular and even less popular health-related conspiracies believed by people, but that's not the only goal. I also want students to understand that as human beings, we all are susceptible to adopting misinformation and even conspiracies. And a 2013 paper by political scientists Oliver and Wood, reported results from a survey of U.S. adults about their beliefs in 6 long-standing health-related conspiracies. And I'll describe them briefly. I'm going to paraphrase, but this is the essence. 1, that the FDA is working with drug companies to hold back natural cures for cancer and other diseases. 2, health officials know that cell phones cause cancer, but are doing nothing about it because of corporate pressure. 3, that the CIA deliberately infected large numbers of African Americans with HIV. Now, this conspiracy is an actual conspiracy that was that penetrated U.S. soil through the Russian KGB. Very carefully placed messages and stories to reporters around the world that eventually landed in the United States to create discord in the African American community against the government. And that was done in the 80s or 90s. And the KGB's admitted to this. Wikipedia has wonderful summaries of all of this. Monsanto, number 4. Monsanto and the Rockefeller and Ford foundations are using GMOs to shrink the world's population. 5. Doctors and the government are hiding their knowledge that vaccines do cause autism, but they want to vaccinate children anyway. And number 6, water fluoridation is really a secret way for chemical companies to dump byproducts into the environment. So I would say, when I read these, I would say that some sound more outlandish than others, and some of them, I have to say, like, I'm one of these people who sometimes am sensitive to corporate interests, and I wonder, is the FDA withholding a drug because somebody has to make a profit? My mind goes that in direct direction sometimes. But as phrased, I would probably reject these. But the reality is that there are many versions of these very carefully worded. They're carefully reworded and then planted in our society, and they spread, they go viral, and they begin to start to intrigue people, and they have sort of this endurance in our society. Now, this study by Oliver and Wood, they found that, if you want to make a guess, what proportion of Americans felt that they agreed with at least one of these? Any guesses? 60%. Did you read the paper? Any other guesses? It's actually 50%. Yeah, excellent, excellent. And so they found that that 1/2 of people surveyed, U.S. adults, believed in at least one of these conspiracies. They agreed with them, and that 18% agreed with 3 or more. Now, these findings actually, at the time, in 2013, these findings contradicted what many people believed or assumed at the time. And it's best encapsulated by what the authors wrote in their paper. So I'll read this quote, 2 sentences. Although it is common to disparage adherents of conspiracy theorists as a delusional fringe of paranoid cranks, our data suggests that medical conspiracy theories are widely known, broadly endorsed, and highly predictive of many common health behaviors. Rather than viewing medical conspiracism as indicative of a psychopathological condition, we can recognize that most individuals who endorse these narratives are otherwise normal, and that conspiracism arises from common attribution processes. And by attribution, this is a psychological term that refers to sort of how we make sense of other people's actions and behaviors and how we explain our own. Right? That paper was very intriguing to me because it reminded me that, you know what, we all can be lured to alternative realities. And frankly, I like a good conspiracy too. The question is, when does that get a little out of control and potentially spread and maybe do some harm in our society? And is there a degree of truth to some of these conspiracies? I think that's another thing that I think that I find important and also worth exploring in our classes. So let me now explore the psychology a little further, and let's first take a look at misinformation. So first, a definition. So misinformation is incorrect information that is shared by someone who is well-intentioned. Okay, very key, well-intentioned. And contrast that with disinformation. And here, disinformation is incorrect information that is spread deliberately. Okay? So surely you can appreciate that the adoption of misinformation is very common. We frequently come across incorrect information, whether we realize it or not. And we're all susceptible to misinterpreting information or recalling it incorrectly. And we can also pass on this incorrect information to others. Now, we mean well, but we aren't being that helpful if we do that. The vast majority of people don't do this deliberately. And quite the contrary, it's our own brain which leads us to adopt and spread incorrect information. Now, when I was in college, one of my favorite professors was Dr. Catherine Carr, a neuroscientist. On the first day of neuroanatomy class, don't ask me why I was taking neuroanatomy. I think because I liked Dr. Carr, and she had taught me neuroscience before that, and I've always, frankly, been this armchair psychologist. I happened to also be dating a psychology major at that time. Maybe that has something to do with it. She said, there are billions of neurons in the human brain, and for this class, you will have to memorize just half of them. Now, you laugh, but let me just say, she was British. She spoke with a British accent, and so my natural inclination was to take her more seriously. And so then I immediately wrote this down, half, memorize, billions. I learned to become a critical thinker a little later on in life. So now, in addition to controlling vital organs and the movements of our bodies, our brains store memories. And they give us our mind, our emotions, and our psychology. It also gives rise to many cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are errors in our thinking. They occur when we are processing and interpreting information that affects the decisions and judgments that we make. So one example, and there are many, but I'll give you just a couple, and here's one. One example is anchoring bias. This is the tendency to rely too heavily on the very first piece of information we learn. The first impression we have when we meet someone for the very first time. Our future interactions with that person are then processed relative to that very first impression that we made, right or wrong. And so if your first impression is incorrect, it can be very hard to develop a new perspective about that person, and it can be done, but not without a lot of effort. And it's important that when we meet somebody for the very first time, that we have a very open mind and allow multiple engagements and multiple interactions we have with someone to be able to shape our thoughts about that person. And this is a bias that can be very powerful. Now, cognitive biases can be caused by many things, including our own emotions, our motivations, our social norms, and also heuristics. And these are mental shortcuts that we take, frankly, all the time. And it's really the only way we can get through our entire day. You guessed earlier, just correctly, I might have to ask you to go first. So scientists estimate the number of decisions we have to make in a given day or a given hour that we are awake. Any guesses as to how many decisions we make in a given hour? 10,000. Do we have any other guesses? Per hour. Okay. 6,000. We were heading in the right direction now. We make about 2,000 decisions per hour. 2,000. You say 200. That's the answer to my next question. So just hold on to that thought, okay? So we make roughly 35,000 decisions per our waking hours in a given day. At night, this is why sleep is so important, right? Because we need to give our mind some rest after making all of those decisions. Most of the decisions we're making, the choices we're taking, we do subconsciously. You know, in the morning, you're not even caffeinated. You know how to make the coffee without any direction, right? You're making a lot of choices because they become programmed. Now, researchers at Cornell made an estimate of how many food-related decisions we make, and the answer is 225, right? Just a little bit more. And I was thinking, and that's for a whole day, not an hour. For me, it could be in an hour, actually, frankly. But yes, 225 food-related decisions that you make on a given day. There's only 3 meals, right? So these cognitive shortcuts, frankly, are very helpful for us to manage all the decisions and all the choices that we have to make day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute. So, for example, to ease our decision making and to save us time, sometimes when confronted with a choice to make, we choose to follow perhaps the status quo. Right? Seems reasonable. Or we might align our thinking with that of an opinion leader, someone that we trust or someone we respect. Or maybe we prefer it that our choices are just simply made for us. Maybe because we're receiving that sort of choice given to us, or lack of choice given to us, a decision, from somebody who's earned our loyalty. Right? Makes sense. Now, these are just a few of the shortcuts that we use every day to decide on a variety of things, from who we're going to vote for in the next election, or to deciding whether we're going to do most of our shopping at Costco. right? Now, interestingly, for shopping, whether it be Costco or Amazon, I'm always fascinated by this, and I am a Costco member, and I shop on Amazon. Uh, I think it's rather amazing that we're willing to pay companies a recurring annual fee that's not small, right, in order to have the opportunity to give them even more money to buy their products, right? I mean, it's just amazing how our minds learn to like to do that. And marketing certainly exploits a lot of these cognitive biases that we have to make things more palatable and more enjoyable, a better experience for us, right? And I like Costco. I like being part of a club. Being a member. Exclusivity. That's kind of nice. And frankly, I don't like shopping. And so I would just prefer somebody tell me what Pomodoro tomatoes to buy, and I hope they have them this week, rather than having a whole shelf full of choices. I'm one of those people sometimes, for some things, I just want I want somebody to get that loyalty from me, right? And Costco does that, and they do it very well. And other sort of wholesale clubs do it very well as well. A very powerful bias that I'm sure you know about is called confirmation bias. Everybody's heard of this. This is our tendency to look for, to interpret, to cling on to information that supports what we believe or what we would like to prove to someone else. Now this may sound counterintuitive, but using the internet, the World Wide Web, can actually make us more narrow-minded. Have you heard this? Yeah. And this is because machines and the internet uses confirmation bias to our advantage, their advantage, disadvantage, I'm not sure, right? But it makes life easier, frankly. But there's some detriment. So when you do an internet search, for example, Google uses algorithms along with your search history, which is stored on your computer, to provide you sort of a tailored set of results that it thinks you want to see as the top hits on the web page. And this is as a way to sort of allow you to feel satisfied with what Google is providing. Now, if you were to perform that exact same search on somebody else's computer, and let's assume they have a very different search history, right? So the algorithms are the same, but the cookies stored on the computer are just very different. You might actually get a different order of search results on your website, on the results page, right? But what Google does is to provide you sort of a personalized experience in order for you to feel good about what you're receiving. And that's confirmation bias in action. Now, Twitter also uses the same algorithm as Google, called PageRank, to make suggestions about who you should follow. Netflix and YouTube use recommender systems to suggest movies and videos that you should watch next, right? Sometimes they're on target. I don't mind this, right? It makes things more convenient. Our news feeds tend to contain items that reinforce what we already know. And on social media, our networks usually comprise of like-minded people, our friends and family, and our coworkers and our acquaintances, usually. And we're all sharing similar content with one another, and all of this is reinforcing our individual and collective beliefs about a subject. So all of this becomes known as what Steph said, our echo chamber. If misinformation happens to be present in our echo chamber, it's going to reverberate. And it may lead us to adopt it more readily and through this mechanism of confirmation bias. Now, we're constantly being given information that makes us feel good and reinforces what we already believe. And the internet can frankly make it quite challenging for us to get out of our bubbles. Another major contributor to our part of our psychology is real-world experience. This also influences our thinking quite heavily. Experience shapes who we trust, but also who we do not trust. Now let's distinguish the words mistrust and distrust. We feel a sense of mistrust when we are suspicious or lack confidence in someone or something. Distrust is mistrust that's based on actual experience. Okay? And that distrust is sometimes, and maybe even often, passed on from generation to generation. So an historical example of this is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This was a study, many of you might have heard of this. This is a study that began in 1932 by the U.S. Public Health Service, in which hundreds of African American men were deceived into thinking that they were receiving medical treatment when in actuality researchers wanted to learn the clinical course of syphilis that went untreated. Now these men were never told that they actually had syphilis, never knew it. And no medical treatment was actually ever provided. And I think what's most alarming about this study was that it went on for 40 years and didn't stop until 1972. And so the harmful legacy of Tuskegee still endures, and there's evidence of that, and we see that every now and then. And so look at this. In a recent national survey of U.S. adults carried out by the Associated Press, and the University of Chicago, only 25% of African Americans surveyed said that they would get vaccinated for COVID if and when the vaccine were made available. Only 25%. Right? And this is a community that's really most disproportionately impacted. Among whites, the proportion was 56%. So higher, but still quite low. Like, I'd like to be in line for the vaccine, right? I don't know, it would change things. But, overall, just under one half, or 49%, of U.S. adults surveyed said they would actually get the vaccine if and when available, right? Maybe there's reasons for that, and these surveys do not do a good job of actually asking what those reasons are, right? So it might surprise others and may not surprise people in the vaccine field or in the public health field. Now, many will say that in recent years there is a growing mistrust in experts and in science. Now, that may be true, but frankly, I think skepticism to new information in science has existed for decades and frankly for centuries, right? And sometimes that skepticism does indeed stem from experience. So, for example, consider what it might be like to be a resident of Flint, Michigan, exposed to lead-contaminated water. That was the result of poor decisions, what one might even say was negligent decisions made by sort of elected and government officials. And if that was your community, you can imagine, you can feel how distrustful you might become of public health locally, right? And this happens often, and that experience can be very powerful and cause people to believe other things that are different from what you and I believe. Now you add to this fear and uncertainty to the mix of emotions, and we're certainly experiencing these feelings right now during this pandemic. Fear and uncertainty cause us to feel like we don't have enough control over our future. And this can feel very disconcerting. It can cause us to alter our perceived risk in really either direction. Maybe we become so worried that we panic, right? Or maybe our reaction is to become more dismissive and deny that there's a problem or something that needs to be done in response, right? Denialism is real. We also have a tendency towards binary thinking. A good example would be the term anti-vaccine. Now, some might assume that people who question whether a vaccine is right for them are against all immunizations, but that's quite the contrary. Research has clearly shown that there are very few people who refuse all vaccines for themselves and their families. All they're really asking is whether this is the right one for me. But the reaction is to bin people into this binary classification of anti or pro. And it's much more complicated than that. I think the better term, which is used, and many of you might have heard this term, is vaccine hesitant. It's more accurate, frankly, and it acknowledges that there is actually a wide range in attitudes towards immunizations. So here's a question. I said we weren't going to talk about, you said I was not going to talk about politics, but let me just do that for a second. But I'm being rhetorical. Is our society divided politically? Right? So many people would say yes. And I go with the status quo sometimes. I'll say that too. But perhaps this is because we have a two-party system, and that only reinforces this belief that we're a divided society. If we actually took the time and to talk to one another in depth about many wide-ranging issues, from social to economic, we might learn that we actually have some shared interests, right, and shared values, and that the sum of our political beliefs actually lies on a continuum, and that labeling people as either red or blue, it's just simply not fair, and it doesn't actually capture what people in a community might really think, right? But this becomes this self-fulfilling process where we label things as red or blue, and everybody thinks that we live in a divided society. And then, as I said, conversations can sometimes break those impressions. Okay, so how do we go about having a conversation with someone we believe is misinformed? So first, I want to make absolutely clear that whether a given person is actually correct in their thinking or not, from their perspective, it's the other person who's misinformed, and vice versa, right? And of course, I am being too simplistic here. I should not be, using words that are binary in nature. It's not accurate to label someone as misinformed or not, or right or wrong. What we really have are two people with their respective beliefs, which were formed using the same cognitive processes that we just talked about, and that we all use. The key ingredients of a high-quality conversation, frankly, is within us. At the 1988 Democratic National Convention in Atlanta, Georgia, Reverend Jesse Jackson said so beautifully during his address the following: "The only justification we have for looking down on someone is that we're going to stop and pick them up." Personally, I think a lot of people might agree that empathy is of the utmost importance in addressing misinformation. After all, we all use the same cognitive processes to sift through information given to us, to evaluate it, and to draw conclusions from it. What might be different is the kind of information before us to process, and the kinds of lived experiences we carry with us day to day. Okay? Some other skills, apart from empathy, that I think are going to be very helpful. The right amount of detachment. Now, depending on the emotions at the time, you may have to summon detachment from within. And what detachment is it's what allows us to do the right thing for its own sake, simply because it's what needs to be done, without worrying about the outcome, what the outcome might be, or how we might feel during that process. Another skill is mindfulness. It takes practice to be fully present, aware of where we are, and to whom we are speaking, to be listening, and not being overly reactive or overwhelmed by what we are hearing and what's going on around us. Also, be in the habit for looking for disconfirming information. Before accepting information that's presented to you, be a critical thinker. Now, as the mantra goes, correlation does not imply causation. So before accepting that A causes B, ask yourself, would not having A meant that B would not have followed? Now, this can be very hard because it involves taking a rather analytical approach to our thinking, which can be exhausting if you do it all the time, but with practice it can become habit forming. If I'm making breakfast in the morning and I said, do I want eggs or cereal? I'm not going to say, well, how would I feel if I didn't have cereal? And how would I feel if I didn't have eggs? At some point, cognitive shortcuts better kick in because I'm going to need to eat in order to move on with my day, right? So being overly analytical is not something we want to do all the time, and frankly, it can maybe even annoy people. You want to do it when it's sort of needed, and that's where, with practice, we sort of improve that. So recognize doubt creators. Is the person or organization providing you information doing so out of self-interest? If so, maybe you should try looking for more impartial sources of information. And finally, recognize that formal education does not play as significant a role as some people might think in addressing misinformation. Okay, so personally, I don't believe you have to address misinformation with someone the first chance you get, unless, of course, there's a threat of some imminent nature. If there isn't an urgency, I might suggest that we actually do a quick self-assessment first. Is this a conversation we can both have with minimal stress and without raising our blood pressure? Now, each relationship is unique, and some can be very complex. Parent-child, teacher-student, friends, spouses, neighbors, new acquaintances, strangers. So first and foremost, we need to establish trust. I might argue that if you haven't established trust with someone, attempting to correct or attempting to point somebody in a different direction, and you might be the one who is actually misinformed, may not be the right thing to do. I think establishing trust is really important. And I think one way to achieve this is, and to reinforce this, is active listening. Now this can be hard to do, but you really have to avoid the temptation to fill silence with your own voice. Also, have patience and approach any disagreements with curiosity. Ask questions that don't elicit a yes-no response. Even better, avoid framing your curiosity in the form of a question altogether. So for example, tell me more about what you're thinking related to that. Also, validate feelings. For example, I can see why that would be concerning. If you identify shared interests, shared values, point them out. You said it. I wish this thing would just go away myself. And above all, avoid lecturing or providing education when addressing misinformation. And this can be hard for people to do, especially in academia. In my class, for one of the exercises, I asked students to work in pairs and do an unscripted sort of role play, an immersion exercise, using techniques that they've learned in class. And they record and submit their assignment for evaluation. And I've noticed over the years that there's always this tendency for many students to default to mansplaining. And just to be clear, the men are not the only ones that do this. It's just that tendency we have to fill silence with talking and to fill it with our own knowledge about a subject. It comes from a sense of insecurity, frankly. Right? Now, when you are the recipient of an invitation to have such a conversation, you're not the one necessarily doing the inviting. Presume positive intentions, and of course engage respectively with civility. So now this is important. When you're trying to get someone to adopt a different view on a subject, the goal is not to push them in that direction. Rather, you want to have a conversation with them that leads them to seek out more and perhaps different information. So I'll make a comment that my class, Conspiracies in Public Health, is entirely lecture-free. No PowerPoint slides at all. The class is administered entirely online, and I engage in weekly exercises and discussions with students, but mostly I leave them alone. I provide sort of weekly feedback. What I do actually is arrange this class in the form of a blog with lots of hyperlinks to lots of contemporary information, literature, scientific as well, but the kinds of things that consumers of health information would usually come across. I want students to understand what's out there. Most of them already do. And frankly, some of these hyperlinks will lead you down a rabbit hole, and that's good. So it's a 2-credit class. Sometimes students make it 5 credits, but it's just 2 credits. And the reason I wanted to create a class that was lecture-free, because I wanted to lead by example. I never tell students how to have these difficult conversations. And frankly, I'm not telling you tonight how to do that either. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all approach. My goal is to present students with all sorts of information and learning activities in hopes that they'll develop their own approach. And I think they would, if they have that goal of looking for shared interests and shared values. I think all of us would be willing to find that solution. So improving our skills in having difficult conversations is something that I think must be maintained. The skills I include in Conspiracies in Public Health are drawn from principles of motivational interviewing, risk communication, and crisis counseling. Now, I used to actually work as a crisis counselor and trainer in between college and graduate school for many, many years ago. I'll also reveal that more recently, on a whim, I did some improv training in Milwaukee. If you've done anybody done improv training? Yeah, excellent. Have or been to improv comedy shows? Right? So many of you know, and if not, not hard to imagine. The number one rule to keeping a conversation going is that you need to start your next sentence with yes and. Right? When you're having a conversation, you don't want to say, no, but, I don't know, but did you think about that? What did you say again? You're not even listening. You gotta say, yeah, I see that. And what about that? And what about this? To be able to keep that flow moving. Improv has been sort of very helpful for my teaching as well. I had another professor, favorite of mine in graduate school, who taught me teaching at the university level, Barbara Kerbo. And she said that teaching is a cross between crisis counseling, and I said, check, and acting. And I'm like, And I decided that I'd try something related to acting, just to see what it was like. Not very good at it, frankly. So, and of course, you always want to surround yourself with valid sources of information and evidence. Look for primary sources of information and avoid opinion or non-credible interpretation of information. So how about social media? Let me just check on the time here. Oh, that's never even turned on. How am I doing okay on time? Okay, great. So how about social media and digital communication like texting? So much of our day-to-day conversations take place without face-to-face interactions, especially nowadays. I think it's worth sort of thinking about that. Now, again, I think if there's an imminent threat and correcting misinformation deserves immediate attention, you got to do it, right? But if you can wait, or even more importantly, if you haven't established that trust with someone, I personally would avoid it, but it's your choice. And that's probably because, I prefer to engage with people in serious conversations, face to face, and not engage this on social media. I'm not an active social media user. Now, for those of you, who teach students, part of your profession, or know teachers, you will understand this observation that I've made. On campus, we welcome new students in our graduate programs year after year after year, a new matriculating class. And in our Master of Public Health program, the average age every year is the same, 25.2, roughly, 25. It doesn't change. What does change is my age. Every year, I get a year older. And every year, there's a greater gap between me and students. And I sort of made that recognition probably 5 or 6 years after graduate school. I recognized that I would say things, and they wouldn't get it. I would tell a joke, and then I would say, what is that? What's Twitter? And I realized that, that's actually not a bad thing to know, because now I can understand, why some folks might complain about kids these days. Well, we were kids one time. I think it's important that we acknowledge that, because our future generation of public health and medical and other health professions, are our future. And I think it's important that we, figure out what's the best way, what's the way that they want to communicate, and learn from them how to do this. I'll give you a little quick story about my graduate student, Sarah Clifford, who was my teaching assistant for Conspiracies in Public Health the last 2 years. She will engage in a conversation on social media with a complete stranger. She's also getting her master's in life sciences communications. And, and despite what I think, or despite what I teach, or what I have her teach in our class, I tell students, you don't necessarily want to engage in a conversation with someone on social media that you don't know at all, and may not even be human. You might just be getting trolled. But she'll do it. And it's really just been a joy to learn from her what her approach is, because it kind of opens up my mind to maybe what I'm missing or not doing. So finally, let me just close with this. So why one conversation at a time? That was what I specified in the title of tonight's talk. It's my opinion, it's my opinion that is what it'll take to improve our own and our community's resistance to adopting and sharing misinformation. So indeed, companies like Twitter, and to a lesser degree Facebook, fact-checking organizations, journalists, are also trying to address the growing problem of misinformation in our society. But often these efforts are reactions to the problem and aren't necessarily preventing the issue from occurring to begin with. So to label or flag a post as incorrect is helpful, but prevention is really, really more important. And that is where I think we can embrace our responsibility to improve our own knowledge and understanding about matters that are impacting our society, improve our skills in listening and talking to others who have views on a subject that are different from our own, and to look for and build our individual and collective goals around our shared interests and values. And so with that, I just say thank you for patiently listening to me, and now I look forward to having our conversation.